I beg to move that this House has considered the impact of the two-child benefit cap on child poverty. And it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Pritchard. And I'm grateful to have the opportunity to lead this debate and to raise the issue of the two-child benefit cap and its impact on child poverty. And I'd like to begin by putting on record my thanks for all of those who have championed this campaign in the 6 years since the cruel cap was introduced in April 2017, including the Bishop of Durham and the Child of the North APPG, on which I sit, who have led and supported the debate in the House of Lords and brought a private member's bill to the other place on this issue. I'm also grateful to the End Child Poverty Coalition and all the member organisations for their All Kids Count campaign and for providing the statistics on the widespread impact of the two-child cap on benefits that I and others will be using in this debate. The explosion of child poverty that we are witnessing today has been the #1 byproduct of the last 13 years of Tory austerity. The current cost of living crisis is adding unbearable pressure to an already critical situation for many families who are struggling to make ends meet. I'm more than happy to give way.
Thank you, Chair. I thank my honourable friend for giving way and for the impassioned contribution which he's making. Scrapping this cruel and pernicious two-child limit would be the most cost-effective way of reducing child poverty, lifting 250,000 children out of poverty in an instant. The Leader of the Opposition has rightly said that the next Labour government will be laser-focused on eradicating poverty. I wonder if my honourable friend agrees with me that to that end our party should make an explicit commitment by scrapping the two-child limit within the first days of the next Labour government, and in doing so give hope to the 2,700 young people in my constituency who are currently caught in this two-child trap.
Johnson.
I thank my honourable friend for his contribution, and I would say that I believe that the incoming Labour government should make every effort to look at eradicating poverty in any way, shape or form. We are seeing a resurgence of Victorian diseases such as malnutrition, rickets and scarlet fever. Children are going to bed with empty bellies and going to school unable to concentrate or learn to their full potential. In recent years, we have heard many heartbreaking stories of children mimicking eating from empty lunchboxes or even attempting to erase their hunger by eating paper and erasers. Children are incredibly aware of the stigma of poverty, and the pressure can have lifelong psychological effects on top of the material impact on educational attainment and life chances and associated health problems.
Lavery.
It's great to see my honourable friend bringing this extremely important debate to the chamber. In my constituency, in the North East, there's 12,000 people, 12,000 children and families unable to claim the benefit, the universal credit benefit, because of the two-child cap. There's also 5,400 not considered eligible to because of the child tax credits and the situation with the universal credit. Will my honourable friend see what sort of impact this has actually got on ordinary families, not just in the North East, but up and down the country?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and yes, the cap has had immeasurable damage on so many families in this country, impacting in terms of poverty and driving more families into poverty and not, as this government anticipated, in terms of into work.
Okay. My own friend for giving way, and I congratulate her on securing this really important debate. According to the End Child Poverty Coalition, over 2,700 children were living in poverty in my constituency, Wirral West, in 2021-22. That's over 18% of the children in the constituency. As she's already touched on, we know that it impacts on children's educational attainment, on their happiness, on their life chances. Would she agree with me that this is a scandalous state of affair? It makes absolutely no sense for us to leave this problem unattended, and we must end the two-child limit as a matter of urgency.
Kim Johnson.
I totally agree with my good friend. We do need to end this horrendous two-child policy, and ensure that all children have an opportunity to thrive and grow and not live in poverty. Last September, when I hosted an event in Parliament in partnership with the End Child Poverty Coalition and the National Education Union, calling for universal free school meals to help alleviate child poverty and close inequalities in education and health, we heard from some incredible youth ambassadors. They told us of the stigma of being singled out for free school meals. One said the impact was if they were sitting in the classroom wearing a badge on their back that said they were poor. Another told us that she remembered her mother skipping meals to make sure she and her siblings had something to eat, and that years later her own relationship with food and the guilt she associated with eating is still impacting her today. Members in this debate and on all sides of the House will be painfully aware of so many other similar personal stories from the constituents they work with every day. Last year, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's annual report on UK poverty showed that child poverty in families with more than 2 children increased from 33% to 47% between 2012-13 and 2019-20, reaching levels not seen since before 1997. And in my own constituency of Liverpool Riverside, 11 children in a class of 30 are living in poverty. And of the 1,400 children in households in receipt of universal credit, 444 of them are not eligible for extra support due to having 2 or more siblings born after the 6th of April 2017. I'm happy to give way.
Rachel Maskell.
My honourable friend giving way and mentioning Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which is based in my constituency. They have also done work not only to demonstrate that the 2-child limit is really having an impact on children, but also the benefits base is not focusing on the essentials and the essential cost under the benefit system, and to put on top of that the fact that the broad rental market area is not paying the way on private rent either, that families in my constituency are particularly struggling with accumulation of the cuts and the drawback which government have put in place. Can she understand why this government are punishing children and families in such a way?
Kim Johnson.
Thank you for the intervention, and I can honestly, I do not know why this government are punishing children and forcing them into poverty. It is a crying shame. These families are disproportionately affected by increases in the cost of living and are treated punitively, as just meant by the benefit system. 1.3 million children across the country are currently losing out under the cap, with their families losing, on average, £3,235 directly out of their pockets. With new stats due on Thursday, the 13th of July, the Child Poverty Action Group and Save the Children predict that the number will rise to 1.5 million. I'll give way.
The CPAG who've estimated that over 4 million children live in poverty, and that figure is due to rise. And in Cannon Valley, my constituency, over 5,000 children, which represents 33, a third of the children living there, live in poverty. Welsh Government is currently consulted on its draft child poverty strategy 2023, and there's a big debate within Wales about how we tackle not only child poverty more widely. And what Wales is very clear about, as the Minister for Social Justice, Jane Hutter, said, is that the 2-child limit must be scrapped. So isn't it right and time that the UK Government listened to the devolved nations and did just that?
Johnson.
I thank my good friend for the intervention. I also thank the Welsh Government for rolling out universal free school meals, and I will support her and Welsh Government to say we do need to end the 2-child cap. But does the Minister really believe that it is acceptable for children to suffer more just because of the number of siblings they have? The 2-child cap on benefits payments is cruel and it's ineffective. Larger families are punished, leaving them struggling. Most families, in fact, 55% are affected by the policy, are already in work. In particular, black and ethnic minority families and single-parent families are disproportionately impacted, as well as families that rent. The 2-child limit creates a huge hole in budgets that simply cannot be plugged by working additional hours. The government claims this policy helps to push parents back into work, But after 6 years, they still can't provide a single shred of evidence that this is actually the case. The truth is that this policy does nothing to remove the barriers to work. And research from the University of York shows that in some cases the cap can be counterproductive in helping parents back to work.
Thanks. I'd like to thank my honourable friend for Liverpool Riverside for giving way and securing this important debate, and for all her campaigning on the issue. And I completely agree with her on the issues of poverty and children suffering. But does she agree with me on a slightly different concern around this punitive policy, that it's an absolute disgrace that the rape clause is still in effect? And could I ask the Minister, please don't ignore this in your speech. Why is it still on the statute books, and why won't the government repeal it?
Johnson.
I thank my good friend for raising that very important issue, and I will come to that point later on in my speech. On top of this, last year, 1,830 mums were forced to declare that they were raped in order to be eligible for extra support for their children, compelled to disclose horrific and personal details. The anguish that this demand creates for women has been found to have an impact on women's decision to terminate pregnancies. Just to take a second to consider that, having survived such a deeply traumatic ordeal, to be faced with a government policy that makes you feel you can no longer carry on with your pregnancy is so deeply cruel and damaging that you have to ask whether the ministers that devised this heartless policy had an ounce of compassion between them. And we know that lifting the cap would immediately lift 250,000 children out of poverty, and a further 850,000 children would be raised out of deep poverty, with child poverty campaigners calling in the single most effective intervention to immediately tackle child poverty. It would cost this government just £1.3 billion. Consider that against the £37 billion wasted by this government on a failed test and trace system, or the £5 billion that the government found for the defence budget in March, or the £9 billion tax cut to corporations and pensions giveaway for the 1% so generously granted by this government in the last budget. We know the money is there to help struggling families if we can only find the will. Poverty is a political choice, and time again, this government has chosen giveaways for the rich and scraps for the rest of us. Inflation is being driven by corporate greed, creating record profits for the super rich. The government would like us to believe there is no money to meet basic needs and support struggling families, but the reality is it's just being hoarded by the 1%. We are seeing the biggest drop in spending power in 70 years. Total spending on public services is set to be 12% lower in 2027-28 than in 2010. Yet the wealth of UK billionaires has more than trebled since the Tories took government, with skyrocketing rent and energy bills eating into people's pay pockets. Disposable income is being more and more squeezed. The record rise in food prices is pushing millions more into food insecurity. And there is a simple fix for this: enhanced workers' rights to ensure that work pays enough to live and raise a family. That way we can assure that not a single child in this country goes hungry and no child gets left behind. The evidence is there for all to see. Punishing families for having more than 2 children doesn't push parents back into work. It only drives more children into poverty. Tory austerity cuts were nothing less than an ideological drive to rig the economy in favour of the few at the expense of the many. And children in my constituency and across the country are now paying the price. The impact of growing up in poverty can be lifelong. We cannot wait for a new Labour government to provide these children with a future. This government must listen now and lift the 2-child cap. This is not the first time I and many of our colleagues here today have raised these issues in this House over the years. We know the tired and misleading lines parroted by the government, pointing to a rise in employment and a drop in absolute poverty over the course of their leadership. So before the Minister gives his reply, I want him to consider the bleak reality of this situation. Work is no longer a route out of poverty. The Tories have undermined workers' rights and trashed the very concept of work, and to the extent that 7 out of 10 of the children living in poverty in this country are living in working families. Just let that sink in for a minute. Over 2/3 of the children who live in poverty in the 5th richest country of the world are struggling because their parents' wage is not enough to live on and to raise a family. And in response to my question to the Prime Minister last month on the 2-child benefit cap, he responded in his usual manner by claiming that his government had lifted 400,000 children out of absolute poverty since 2010. And I'm sure members in this room would all agree that on the face of it, that sounds like a really great achievement and worth celebrating. However, as the Prime Minister and his government well knows, that statistic is misleading and does not take into account the impact of inflation, an approach that can only be described as grotesquely out of touch during the cost of living crisis. When we are seeing security tags put on basic necessities like babies' nappies and baby milk, economists and organisations such as the Institute for Fiscal Studies use relative poverty as a much more accurate measure of the reality of the trajectory in poverty. And this measure clearly shows the deepening trend in child poverty that we see every day in our constituencies. So I ask the Minister again in his response to this debate today, do not take us for fools. We are here because we know the desperate reality facing so many of our constituents. We are here to demand better for them. We will not continue to go round in circles debating meaningless numbers while the government continues to bury its head in the sand and ignore the struggles of the people it was elected to represent. And I thank the Minister again for considering this debate and the arguments we've made here today. And I hope he can feel the strength of feeling about the fact of poverty in this room today. Thank you.